In 1940, after the United States began mobilizing for World War II, Edward B. Reynolds submitted several ethnographic accounts to his employer, the Federal Writers Project, FWP. The subject was the operation of and worker attitudes at the massive copper smelter in Anaconda. A day's work, like his other accounts, was a short story. It begins with management assigning an unnamed protagonist to a job at the smelter's 580-foot smokestack. "The stack!" the man exclaims angrily. "Rapping treaters or dumping flue dust. That was a job for sodbusters and greenhorns, not for a guy that had been born and raised right here on the ground, here in Anaconda." 1. Rapping treaters and dumping flue dust to collect arsenic, a byproduct, was considered dangerous, unhealthy, and low-status labor. Workers wore masks and protective clothing, hoping to keep arsenic out of their lungs and off their bodies. It was the second of these that most worried the protagonist. When you sweat and the dust touches your skin, it turns to arsenious acid that eats into the body and leaves nasty sores. There is something unpleasant and humiliating about these sores, under the arms, between the legs, around the waist. You look at them and treat them in the privacy of your room. You're ashamed of them, the man resignedly concludes, before comparing arsenic collection to another job with a reputation for injuring workers. It's not like the hot metal, where the leaping, roaring flames and the fiery glow of molten metal places danger on a high level. 2. Blood and Bread, a second Reynolds account, directly addressed smeltermen's and copper miners' views about mobilization. The protagonist sets the scene. Butte and Anaconda were booming, and we all had jobs. Far down underground in Butte, men were digging ore from the veins of the richest hill on earth, and over in Anaconda, men were boiling that ore down into molten copper that glowed a bloody red. He then compares the presses and working men's perspectives. Sinews of war, the editorial writers call it. Bread and butter, say the miners and smeltermen. Yes, they agree, war is hell, but work is hell too, and starving to death is a damn sight worse. Reynolds's protagonist in his third FWP account, who works in the hot metal part of the smelter, compares soldiering to home front labor. After confirming he is registered for the draft, he adds, "Anytime Uncle Sam needs me, he knows where I am, but I've a hunch he's going to need me a lot more right where I'm at." This protagonist underscores that he is not afraid.
"People will think he's yellow for not joining the military. I told you I work in the hot metal, didn't I? People that are yellow just don't work there." 4. Reynolds' accounts and the pre-war and wartime experiences of Montana miners and smeltermen, including Reynolds, offer a useful entry into the topics of this chapter: the environmental history of the home front and the places that represent that history. Historians Thomas Robertson and Richard P. Tucker have recently argued that no war transformed natural environments more than World War II. Developments on the American home front, though less well known than battles that remade coastlines, fields, and forests, are fundamental to their assessment. It is difficult to overstate the significance of militarization, which undergirded and in turn was supported by the massive expansion of military-controlled land and the expansion of production and extraction in support of the war effort on the home front's environmental history. The wellspring of home front militarism was the elevation of soldiers to the center of national life and the establishment of the armed forces as the most critical aspect of national security. Both were changes from the Great Depression, as Reynolds' experiences illustrate. Reynolds was one of many who lost their job to the Great Depression. He found work with the FWP, one of the New Deal work programs that the Roosevelt administration designed to offer relief to struggling families and individuals. Such programs, as historian Peter Rody has recently shown, were part of Roosevelt's 1930s vision of national security, which included Americans' economic well-being as much as protection from outside attack. Roosevelt's words and policies, Americans' isolationist posture, and a look at the state of the military during that decade all support this conclusion. Things began to change during mobilization, as hot metal reflects. During the war, conservatives, with Roosevelt's help, winnowed this broader idea of national security down to protection, primarily through the military. As historian Aaron Hiltner writes, once the war began, Roosevelt consistently promoted the idea that civilians ought to serve and support a widespread militarization of American life. With this idea came an expansion of executive authority, government bureaucracy, and military power. After Pearl Harbor, Reynolds and many other working men across the country enlisted or were drafted, powerfully signaling this transition. Historian James T. Sparrow pithily calls this a passage from a welfare to a warfare state, arguing that big government emerged not during the Great Depression, but on the home front. An essential part of this
shift was re-amplifying a business ethos into a government newly focused on supporting military victory through mobilizing natural resources, people, and industry into military might. 11. Roosevelt repeatedly told home-front Americans the nation needed ever-increasing production. The lives of our soldiers and sailors, the whole future of this nation, depend upon the manner in which each and every one of us fulfills his obligation to our country. As military defeats piled up early in the war, for instance, he rallied workers and industry by calling for production, uninterrupted production. Pointedly, he told his radio audience in late February 1942, "We are coming to realize that one extra plane or extra tank or extra gun or extra ship completed tomorrow may, in a few months, turn the tide on some distant battlefield. It may make the difference between life and death for some of our own fighting men." Militarism and the ideology of production provided cover for businesses that took the opportunity to produce and profit without fear of polluting and gave almost no room to those who wished to question the environmental consequences. This militarized national defense sensibility, which also came to define the environmental views and practices of most ordinary Americans, would continue into the post-war period. The impact of the War Department, renamed the Department of Defense in 1949 on the home front, is the focus of the first section of this chapter. The War Department played a central role in the development of the Manhattan Project and the atomic testing associated with it. These are the best-known parts of home front environmental history. But even the commonly understood ramifications of atomic testing fail to account for the environmental impact of Manhattan Project facilities, which occupied vast spaces across the country on nearby land and water. The same sort of environmental impact occurred with the Army, Army Air Force, and Navy bases, as well as other defense facilities the War Department developed during the war. Indeed, the department, as the environmental historian Jared Farmer has noted, became one of the government's primary landlords during the home front era, especially in the West and the South. Military bases, bombing ranges, the Manhattan Project, chemical and biological testing facilities, and ordnance plants are discussed in detail in this chapter. The second section of the chapter looks at the environmental history of industrial and agricultural production on the home front. The Anaconda Stack directly links to the fight over industrial air pollution. In the decades before the war, workers, community members, local farmers, and the progressive-era federal government, including its most famous environmentalists, Theodore Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, fought against pollution. The company that owned the smelter opposed these efforts and other environmental regulations. Echoing the argument they made in the late 19th century, no smoke, no wages for working men, companies claimed regulations would prevent them from adequately paying workers. That pattern continued during the war, with one major alteration. Corporate bosses now said addressing pollution would stymie war production. Air and water pollution increased dramatically at U.S. factories. The arsenic collected at the stack reinforced worker health problems. It also alludes to the complicated relationship between home front ecology, agriculture, and social and political forces. In the mid-1920s, Anaconda began selling arsenic dust to cotton farmers to combat boll weevils and increase yields. The importance of insecticides, including new chemical applications, grew after Pearl Harbor, in tandem with the rapid loss of farm labor, the sodbusters referenced in A Day's Work, to higher-paying war production jobs and to the military. The third and final section of this chapter discusses the broader story of mineral and metal extraction and production, as well as timber, coal and oil extraction, and lumber and energy, coal, petroleum and hydroelectric production. The Butte mines and Anaconda smelter represent this. In 1942, the Anaconda smelter and its partner facility, the Black Eagle Copper Mill and Refinery, turned ore mined in Butte by more than 9,000 miners into 250 million pounds of copper, 144 million pounds of manganese, and 47 million pounds of zinc. They were part of the effort to extract an unprecedented amount of natural resources from the home front landscape and produce the raw materials essential to war industries. Environmental factors ranging from climate to terrain to disease shaped pre-industrial warfare, but had limited, mostly localized environmental effects. The American Civil War marked a transition, demonstrating the ways mechanized violence could shape nature. 16th World War I more fully revealed this, with immense mobilization of resources, personnel, and equipment, a new scale and level of state planning, and, especially in Europe, of environmental destruction on battlefields. 17th, the mode and geography of battle would change again between World War I and World War II. While World War I was fought through relatively static, geographically limited engagements, World War II was mobile and global. Communication and transportation advances effectively shrank the distances within the home front and between it and the front lines. North America's bounty of natural resources and the Roosevelt administration's management of wartime mobilization, a safe distance from the front lines, gave the Allies an extraordinary advantage. The way Germany and Japan fought the early battles of the war and the geographically dispersed nature of those battles illustrated the profound difference between the mode of warfare in World War I and World War II. The U.S. military realized it would require a different approach both in combat and home front training. The combined arms and inter-service operations that came to characterize the American World War II military featured an assortment of new weapons. Those weapons, which were also sometimes supplied to American allies, required a retooled and highly complex nationwide production infrastructure that involved a vast number of communities. The mobility, speed, firepower, and range of these weapons also necessitated far more space for training. Unlike World War I, where much training was done close to the European front lines, during World War II, U.S. forces largely trained at home in newly constructed or expanded bases. 19. The military added more than 50 million acres, an area larger than Kansas, to the lands it managed. Development of military bases, resource extraction, and/or war production impacted the land and water of virtually every native nation. Most new or enlarged bases were in the South and the West, where the dramatically expanded military presence would change economies and social relations while shaping attitudes and politics for decades. To give a sense of scale, from 1790 to 1940, the military added 2.6 million acres to its holdings, or 1/20th of what it added during World War II. The military purchased 6.7 million acres from private owners, displacing approximately 60,000 families from approximately 30,000 farms. Grazing districts became bombing ranges, cornfields turned into ordnance works, apple orchards were replaced by plutonium reactors. Roughly 43.3 million acres were leased from other federal agencies, states, or municipalities. The military preferred government leasing because it had little to no cost, was easy and fast. So-called unimproved lands were especially attractive because the law required improved lands leased by the federal government to be restored to their previous condition. The military acquired a large amount of ecologically sensitive land from other government agencies that were compelled to drop their conservation efforts due to wartime necessity. Robert Wilson found that the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Civilian Conservation Corps (CCC) decreased game-bird decline by establishing dozens of avian refuges along migratory routes. However, World War II put an end to most of these programs. The War Department took 4.6 million acres from 33 wildlife refuges. Marshlands became docking facilities, and desert tortoise habitats were taken over by airfields. The military received almost 2,000 permits from the National Park Service. It operated on longer-term agreements in virtually every national park along the Pacific, Atlantic, and Gulf coasts, often establishing aircraft warning sites and other defense installations. Prioritizing defense activities also interrupted civilian conservation.
Corps, CCC, and other New Deal initiatives in national parks. Historian John Mansavage writes that Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes and NPS Director Newton Drury were staunch conservationists who sought to protect national parks from unnecessary military use. Ickes and Drury fought to limit grazing and logging at parks like Sequoia and Olympic, which they were told were necessary to support the war-fighting machine. As soon as the war ended, the NPS terminated as many military permits as it could and restored the parks to their former condition wherever practical. However, the NPS also permanently transferred 6 land parcels, almost 10,000 acres, to the military. The military left some parks dramatically impacted, including Hawaii Volcanoes National Park on the seized sovereign territory of Kanaka Maoli, native Hawaiians. Motorized maneuvers and arms practice caused widespread damage and widely scattered unexploded ordnance. Land availability, climate, landscape type, population centers, transportation infrastructure, and hydrological and other resources helped determine where home front defense facilities were placed. Different types of training, testing, and production required specific environmental characteristics. Some places, especially those that came to be associated with uranium mining, atomic, biological, and chemical weapon testing, and bombing ranges, evidenced the government's propensity for what historian Tracy Bryn Voiles calls wastelanding. Voiles shows that environmental racism was a cornerstone of this approach to land and ecology. The government saw native lands and those associated with communities of color as unimportantly inhabited and without value, lacking material and ideological worth.
Military bases. The expansion of older military bases and creation of new ones profoundly reshaped the landscape and the built environment through massive construction projects. 33 Army leaders selected Fort Benning, now Fort Moore, Georgia, a World War I basic training camp, later famous for being home to the United States Army Airborne School, as the primary infantry training site. More than 90,000 personnel came to call Benning home, and its footprint expanded to over 300 square miles. Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty, North Carolina, the current home of the 82nd Airborne and Special Forces Command, played a major role in artillery training. Other camps, Jackson, Hood, now Cavazos, and Knox, for example, also grew exponentially to house and train thousands of soldiers. In their recollections, those soldiers remember base facilities as hastily constructed, with dirt everywhere. One soldier commented that bases seemed to be in a constant state of erosion. 34. This was a result of the massive amount of earth moving required to construct the bases and the ways military equipment constantly tore up the landscape, indicating one type of substantial environmental damage connected to these facilities. For new bases, the Army targeted sites that were ill-suited for agriculture, moderately flat, had a mild climate for year-round training, and were located near sizable cities with leisure facilities and railroad access. Meeting all these requirements was not always possible. Camp Stewart, which later became Fort Stewart, opened in August 1940 as 5,000 leased acres near Hinesville, Georgia. Later land purchases expanded the base to more than 437 square miles, displacing approximately 1,500 black and white farm families and tenants. The area's ideal topography and its proximity to Savannah and the Army Air Force's AAF Hunter Airfield made it attractive as a major anti-aircraft artillery training center, which overrode concerns about the impact on local families. Camp Stewart also served as a prisoner of war camp. The Army Air Forces sought extensive space and especially coveted well-drained level land without significant tree density to support the expansion of military aviation. In September 1939, the U.S. military had 3,470 aircraft and 17 air bases, but only its 23 B-17 bombers were considered modern. By July 1944, the AAF had nearly 80,000 aircraft. They flew out of 345 main bases, 116 sub-bases, and 322 auxiliary fields. The 20,000 military personnel assigned prior to the war grew to nearly 2 million by 1945. Bases totaled 19.7 million acres by 1945. Eglin Airfield in the Florida Panhandle, built on Muskogee ancestral homelands, is only one of the many sites that exemplifies the astonishing expansion of home front military landholdings for aerial operations and the manipulation of that environment. Prior to the war, much of the land was part of the Choctawhatchee National Forest. In 1908, the U.S. Forest Service, USFS, began restoring the land so it could better support cut-over longleaf pine stands. In 1933, the CCC established a camp in the forest, from which they built fire lookout towers, improved timber stands, and added roads and recreational facilities. When it came to the attention of U.S. military planners, Eglin was a 1,500-acre landing strip within the forest. It shared characteristics with much of the land the War Department acquired: cheap or free, flat, and near a town and/or railway. In October 1940, the USFS ceded almost 400,000 acres to the War Department. Significant deforestation and land manipulation followed. Suggestive of the long-term militarization of land and waterscapes during the war, Eglin remains among the largest U.S. Air Force installations in the world, comprising 725 square miles of land and 125,000 square miles of water.